If you've never dealt with a CV axle just like this one in front of me before, this can look like a pretty daunting sight. My name is Danny Krugeer with FCP Euro, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to rebuild both your inner and outer CV joint on an axle similar to this style on your own vehicle, kind of regardless of make. Once you start sort of peeling back the layers on this, these are really simple systems to work on, and I'm going to walk you through exactly how to refresh the whole system. So out the gate with any of these axle refreshes, rebuilds, really whenever you're removing it from the car, this is going to be a pretty messy endeavor. So I just want to lay out the groundwork here that you're definitely going to want some gloves when you get to this stage if you haven't already put them on, a couple of rags handy, some brake clean. There's no way around getting a little messy. Wear your worst clothes. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you're going to be able to put this all back together yourself, save a little bit of money, and especially if you were considering buying a full axle assembly in the first place, save a lot of money because just doing the joints and reusing your axle shaft is going to save you potentially hundreds of dollars. In terms of on your specific vehicle, the one that I have right in front of me here, this axle is from a Mark V Volkswagen Golf GTI. We're going to be using inner and outer CV kit bought from us, FCP Euro. They're going to be pretty comprehensive. In terms of your personal vehicle, if you need help getting the axle out, we recommend just searching for any other DIY on the internet. If you do own a European vehicle, we have a whole list of different service videos for axles and a whole bunch more over on our FCP Euro YouTube page. You can always access that. That'll coach you through it. Otherwise, you can use YouTube as a resource to get this out, and once you get to this stage, we can kind of help lead you in the subsequent details. Without further ado, we're just going to dive right in, get messy, start knocking it out. So we're going to start out here with a nice hammer, and in this case I have a cold chisel. Flathead should do the job plenty well. I'm actually going to start with the inner CV here. So the first thing we're going to do, because it's a bolt style as mentioned, I'm going to knock off the cap, which is then going to expose some of the inner contents to actually get the CV off. So all I'm going to do, there's a small lip right here. It's kind of hard to see with all of the grease on this failed axle. As you can see, we have a big old rip. So I'm just going to knock. That's one side loosened up, and you're just going to kind of keep rotating it, giving it a tap all the way around, and eventually this will come off. I urge you, as you get closer to the end, to be gentle with your taps, because when it does come flying off and hits the ground, it has a tendency to sling grease everywhere, and you don't want to be wearing it just yet. We're pretty early in the service here. So I will knock this guy off, and we will check back in. All right. So if, of course, you are thinking of doing this rebuild on your axle, typical symptoms besides this very, very obviously split boot right here, or slinging grease all over the underside of your car when you look underneath, you may have a vibration in the steering wheel if it's on your drive wheels, or even in the rear end of the car if the car is rear-wheel drive and you have an axle failing back there. Additionally, a very common symptom as you have dirt, grime, anything going into the actual bearings of the CV itself, which again, I'll show you in a minute here, you'll start hearing a popping or a clicking noise, particularly when you're turning. So definitely pay attention to that. If you're having those symptoms, you're probably going to want to rebuild or replace the axle. Today we're going to be showing you how to do that, so just stay tuned. So now that I've removed the end cap on the axle, on the inner CV joint here, comes our first very messy part of this install. So there is going to be a snap ring that holds the CV onto the axle shaft, because ultimately at the end of the day, both the inner and outer CV sort of just slide onto an axle shaft that has splines, and then they're both held in place by either a C-clip or a circlip. It's going to depend on the vehicle that you're looking at, but ultimately what I'm going to be looking for in here that keeps this from moving and falling off the end of the axle shaft is going to be a clip that's holding it and kind of locking it in. So all I'm going to do is pull it backwards. I'm going to have to clear a bunch of this grease off, and I will then be able to expose what I believe on these is a circlip. I can remove that and then pull this straight off. I'll show you right here. Just going to give it a nice little bit of a tap to slide this down. And then there's a circlip. I'm going to grab a paper towel and wipe it off so you guys can see it. So, going to just clean off the face here. Some nasty, dirty old grease, and this will start to get nasty over time. Not as much just with age, but as you'll start getting water or dirt or grime ingressing. That's why you want to keep up on boots if they're ripped, because as this grease gets nastier with water exposure or dirt exposure, that's where you're going to prematurely wear out your CV. We want fresh grease in here, which is why you're going to want to source a rebuild kit that includes new grease. The majority of them will. In this instance, we're going to be using a Miley kit for the outer and then a GKN kit for the inner. Those are OE products. So it's going to be a really trustworthy source. If you're buying for your European vehicle, again, you can always just hop on our site. We're going to have some really good options for you. If you are buying for a non-European vehicle, do a little bit of research to make sure you're putting a part that you trust on your vehicle. So now that we have this nice circlip exposed, I'm going to grab some circlip pliers. Again, we do have those listed on our site as well if you need a set. But you're literally just going to spread this. If you don't have circlip pliers, this can be a bit of a pain. You can kind of finagle it with a flathead. I'm going to use the right tool for the job, and it's going to make it a lot easier. I'll be right back. So we do have a kit here of different circlip pliers. The ones you're going to kind of want to go for one where you have to spread the circlip, going to be one that's sort of spring-loaded. So this one, if I squeeze it, it snaps right back shut. It's going to make it a lot easier because they have kind of a broad spreading width, which is exactly what we're trying to do. Open up the circlip so we can unseat it from the groove that it sits in on the axle shaft. So I'll just slide it in and give it a nice good squeeze. Oop, it popped off a little bit, but give it a nice good squeeze. Unseat it. Our kit should include this circlip as well, whatever you're using. Just in case though, it's always good to keep it. We would massively, of course, prefer not to reuse these, just because as you're trying to get them off, you never know if you're going to kind of loosen the tolerances, spread them a little bit, tweak them a little bit. So if you do have a new one in your kit, definitely go with that. That being said, it's good to save them just in case you do have some issue where you lose the circlip along the way. You obviously don't want to be sitting here with an unassembled axle and no way to put it back together. So now that we have the circlip released, the only thing that's kind of holding our inner CV joint on is going to be the CV boot. Typically with one of these, you're going to have an inner and an outer clamp. They're going to be holding the boot on, which is also going to be locking the CV onto the axle shaft. This one is actually missing its outer boot already, so that makes our job a lot easier, I guess. We only have to do 50% of the job. In order to get one of these off, preference of how you're going to remove it is entirely dependent on the user. A lot of people like to just cut these. You can bend them out of the way with this flathead screwdriver. You can kind of do whatever you want with it. You can take your cold chisel that you use to pop the end cap off and just knock it loose. Ultimately, we're not going to be reusing these. So as long as you manage to get it off of the CV, you'll be able to get your CV joint off and then pull the axle boot off. Okay, so we have the boot clamp removed. I'm just going to slice open the CV boot here because of course we will not need this anymore. Generally going to want a pretty sharp knife. This one's a little dull, just watch your fingers. Should be good here. I'm just going to rip it apart. So now that we've separated this, you're going to see I'll just be able, with a little bit of coaxing, I might use a dead blow mallet or something just to gently tap this off the axle shaft. But because we removed that circlip, there's ultimately nothing that's actually holding the CV onto the axle shaft. So I'm going to get nice and dirty here. Grab the whole assembly and just kind of wiggle it. Very crunchy in there. So I am going to grab that dead blow and just kind of tap it moving around. It should come right off. This is where we talk about that blast radius of if it comes flying off and hits the ground, you will get covered in grease. So make sure you prep an appropriate area for all of the grease to come flying off. So this is an outer portion of the CV. As you are about to see in a minute when I walk you through this thing is pretty bad. That's going to be the outer portion. You have these ball bearings that sit inside of a cage in here. These ones have lived a rough life. So this is an instance where you would definitely rather replace the CV than try and repack it with grease. I'll show you some of the indicators of when it's worth calling her DOA and just moving on to a new CV joint. But then we can pull this guy off and knock this the rest of the way off, pull our boot off, and then start prepping all of this to be reassembled. So there you go. You see it just started to work over the splines. There is a lip here that it kind of sits on. Just plop this guy off probably. Yep. So normally this would actually be sitting in here. And then just kind of a quick demonstration, if I can, with the state of how disassembled this thing is, these bearings actually almost sit in this cage, which allows things to move and articulate as you're going over bumps or cornering. And these ball bearings are the surface that it can move on while sitting inside of the joint, which of course, in this instance, this will bolt to the transmission. You may have a splined insert where it looks a lot more like the outer here. The typical giveaways that you'd want to replace one of these rather than repacking them with grease and just putting it back together, if you weren't having a previous noise or clicking, popping, any sort of weird behavior, one big one for us here is if you look at the grease that is actually on the CV joint here, you'll notice it's very chunky and lumpy. Same thing on this axle shaft, it's even a little bit discolored. That's a really good indicator that A, the grease itself may have just gotten nasty over too long of an amount of time to the point where it's no longer lubricating and allowing things to move smoothly anymore. Or what's also very possible given our ripped boot here is an accumulation of moisture or grit that's going to cause everything to kind of wear prematurely. What that can ultimately lead to, pitting, flat spots on these ball bearings, and a ball bearing needs to be smooth and round in order to work properly. We would want to replace these regardless. Fortunately, we have a replacement kit right here, so we're going to be replacing this whole inner CV. All right, so now that we have the CV removed, we're going to be able to just remove our torn boot. Just slide right off like so. It might fight you a little bit at the end because it's a nice tight fit. That is, of course, if you didn't already just cut it open down the side to pop it off. Now, this is a pretty important step for us. So now that we have this down to the bare axle shaft, which admittedly looks a lot less intimidating than it might have a little bit earlier. All we're going to do is focus on taking some brake clean. We have a CRC product that I'm going to be using here, and just taking some rags, taking the time to clean and prep the surface, get everything nice, fresh, get all this nasty grease out of there, because this stuff, this old, grimy, gritty grease is what's going to ruin your new one. That's why we're going to be trying to get as much new, clean grease in there as possible while getting none of this. So I'm going to clean this, prep it, get everything nice, and then we'll start reassembly. All right, so we have our axle shaft cleaned up here. We've already gotten our old CV out of the way. That thing was toast, but we have our new kit, our Mila kit right here laid out in front of us. We're just going to kind of work through this whole kit backwards. So piecing together exactly how we took things off, putting them back on, and as you kind of have probably started to figure out now, it's not that complex of a system. It's really just your boot, your joint, fill it with grease, and then use the circlip to hold it on the shaft itself. So I'm going to start by putting my boot on, because of course that would be a bad thing to leave until last when you have everything put back together. We are going to fill this with a fair amount of grease inside of the axle boot itself, and then we'll move things around, which will help to lubricate this, and then of course we'll put some grease on the CV itself. So I am going to use a pick just to coax this over this lip. You probably won't need to do this depending on what vehicle you're working on, because typically you'll just have an outer clamp instead. This is sealed on the outer side of the boot here just by sliding over this lip. There's no actual clamp used to do it. Because of that, it's a little bit more difficult. You got to be very careful not to tear your new boot. Just going to coax it up and over the lip of the axle shaft here. All right, then you're just going to kind of work it down. And ultimately, of course, the goal is going to be to get the boot down far enough so that we can see the splines and then align our CV directly over the top. So right now you can kind of see I'm just starting to get the splines out this way. We're going to need to wiggle this up a bit more. So now I can kind of fold this in on itself, cut the zip tie loose on the CV, and then start working it on here. And then ultimately, after we have everything properly greased, that's when we'll just throw our circlip on and hold everything together. So before I even get too far in with any of the subsequent install, we want to make sure that everything is properly lubricated, of course. Biggest issue that'll kill one of these things is a lack of lubrication or any contaminants in the lubrication. So let me get this up here a little bit more. There we go. And then I'm going to take this grease packet. This should generally be included in whatever CV kit you're using. I'm going to put about half up inside of the boot so that it can all transfer around once things are moving around. And then I'm also going to take the rest of the grease packet, kind of stick it around into these ball bearings, kind of work things around by hand, move it around a little bit. And then once I put this all back together, I'll really move it around a fair amount. The reason I'm going to wait on that is because A, these balls can pop out. You kind of saw it when we were disassembling things before. Generally, if it's a newer one, it's going to be a lot harder to do, but you don't want to work this too much without it being a sealed system. So in addition to the fact that, of course, you don't want to move the center too much to the point where you're going to dislocate any of these ball bearings, depending on the CV that you have, these holes on the outer perimeter may be threaded. And additionally, if you get any extra grease either in those threads or in the receiving flange that's on the side of the transmission, if you use Loctite or anything, it's possibly negated by the fact there will be grease in those holes. So you want to keep these holes as clean as possible so that when you go to reinstall the axle, you're not risking any contaminants going into where the Loctite might be and where you want things to stay holding things tight. So I will lube things up a little bit. Just rip off the corner of the grease packet and just squeeze it right in. Just putting about a half of the grease packet all around the axle shaft here. Good. So now this is a pretty good chance for us to get a little bit messy, so you're going to want your gloves, maybe a rag on the side. I'm just going to take the remainder of our grease packet and work it around on top of these ball bearings. Right. And then if you are confident in what you're doing, really, you can kind of work this around a little bit. You are taking the risk that if you work it around too much and it's not a closed system, you can kind of dislocate that center part of the CV. I'd personally recommend, just for the sake of your own ease, if you can make sure all of this is assembled and greased properly, you've used all your grease, put things back together, totally reassemble the axle with the circlip, and then once it's a capped system, which I'll show you very shortly, you can kind of move things around, get everything properly lubricated. Before you get to that point, though, you do want to make sure you have all of the grease that you have on hand kind of filled inside the boot, filled inside the joint, so that everything at least has grease on it to begin with. So now going to take this. Actually, I'll put the little teeny bit of grease that we have left back in the boot. All right, that is our grease packet empty. Now going to take our CV, slide it on so the splines are aligned. This can be a little bit of a tricky process. Just get it started. And then this is a really good chance, if you have the opportunity, now that you have the splines aligned, this may need a knock with a dead blow hammer or something like that. Just make sure that as you're hitting it, you're hitting in this inner circle, because if you hit this outer circle, you have the risk of dislodging the cage. If you hit it right in here, you're just going to move it down the shaft. You can steady this with your hand if you'd like, and just tap either with a big socket or just knocking gently around, and you'll see it'll slide right down in a second when I do so. That is effectively all we need, and the reason that you can tell that is actually because right in here we have the insert for that circlip. Ultimately, all we're going to need to actually hold this system together is going to be our circlip right into that lip, and then this will be locked onto the axle shaft. So we have our boot on, we have the clamp holding it to the CV, and then ultimately we'll put our cap back on the end, which is a press fit, and we'll be good to put this end back in the car. For our sake, though, we're going to move on to the outer. So I'm going to take a tiny little bit of grease, just move it around in here, just because, of course, the balls that are doing the moving, the ball bearings, are also going to need a little bit of lubrication down here, and then we'll throw the circlip on, close this back up. And then I am going to get that last little bit out of that bolt hole as mentioned. So just cleaning things up, and I'll actually take this rag and I'll fold it over my pick as soon as I put this all back together to actually run the rag through. I'll show you that in a minute. So we have that on there. I will grab my grease cap, I'm going to stick it right over the end, and then we'll kind of tap everything back together so this becomes a closed system. One thing, of course, to mention, by the way, as you're putting this on, we still have the front half of our boot unclamped because in this instance there is no clamp, but of course you're going to want to make sure you're lining up the bolt holes with the front plate on the boot. So that way, of course, you can pass your bolt through. In this instance, fortunately, because it's not clamped, we can just twist things a little bit. There we go. So those are properly aligned. Now I can press this on. And then we have our rear cap here. Your kit may include a new one. In this instance, our kit did not include a new one. So what I did was cleaned everything up. Again, we really want to get that nasty, chunky old grease out. We did a great job on this one. So we are going to put a little bit of whatever is left in here, just around the inside. Extra lubrication is never going to hurt anything. Of course, we will put our circlip back on, and then we'll just smack this back together. Okay, going to be the same thing as last time. We're just going to put it on, spread it nice and wide. Just kind of coax it on. There we go. Make sure it's seated nice. You can actually take your circlip pliers, just kind of insert them as if you were going to take it on or off. And then once we have them in there, you can just kind of spin to make sure that it's actually seated in the groove. We clearly are in this instance. So what's nice is now this is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to come flying off this way or anything. So we can take our rear cap, tap it back on, make sure everything is lined up bolt hole wise, and then our inner CV is done. We can move on to the outer. And then as I mentioned earlier on, now that we have everything sealed back up, we have all of our grease inside, you can just kind of move it all around, in and out, let things lubricate. You'll feel everything moving nicely, which is a key trait of our new grease. We have one final step, possibly the easiest of all. This is CTA 4210. These are boot clamp pliers. What's really nice about these, you can just grab right on top by the boot clamp, give it a little squeeze, and it will cinch down our CV boot. And this is now not going anywhere. So nice little product from our site. These are relatively cheap. They're going to make your job a lot easier than if you're using really any other kind of plier. This side is done. All right, so with our inner wrapped up, we have everything kind of buttoned back together here. I think I did say earlier that you generally would have an outer boot clamp. This axle in particular, because the shaft itself flares out, that's why it took me so long to actually work the boot over that lip. This kind of has its own self-sealing system. You'll probably have both an inner clamp and an outer clamp unless you're working on a very similar design to this Mark V GTI that we're working on. But with the inner all sealed up, we can now move on over to our outer. This is going to be a little bit more complicated on this vehicle in particular, but if you have an axle that has spline ends on both sides and slides directly into the transmission, this is going to be more what you're looking for. Of course, if you have a bolt together, this would have been helpful for you, but we're going to start by cracking these boot clamps open, just as we did on the other side. I'm actually probably just going to cut it off because we are definitely not reusing these clamps. You don't have to be nice to them when we're not reusing, and I don't really think you can reuse these to begin with in any shape or form. So we have those off now, which means we'll be able to knock the CV open. This side was not torn. Obviously, our other side was quite severely torn, but this boot, if you look in tight, you can see it's got all kinds of signs of pitting and dry rotting. So this one did not have much more life left in it. Fortunately, we are replacing this whole section with our GKN kit. So in this particular axle's case, rather than using an axle bolt, or an axle nut rather, to hold it together, where you normally would slide these splines through the hub, then you would screw a nut on the end, these axles in particular actually use an axle bolt. So this is going to help us twofold. One, when we're filling the axle with grease later, we can screw this in, and that'll kind of create a quick seal so that we can squeeze a ton of grease in and not worry about it going up and out of the axle shaft or the axle splines themselves. But additionally, if you are in a situation where you're unable to separate the actual CV from the shaft, you can actually just keep screwing this bolt in, and it'll start almost leveraging the actual CV off of the shaft itself. We are going to have another either a C-clip or a circlip that's going to be holding this on, so we'll want to take that off first. But this may be helpful in actually getting the stub off of the axle shaft itself. So I'm just going to thread this back in there, and then we'll take a look. Nice and nasty. Oh yeah. So we just got our boot down, and as you can see, the grease looks marginally better than our other side. That's likely because this boot isn't ripped wide open. It does look a little bit more like grease rather than chunky and green. But I do anticipate there's probably a circlip that we're going to need to either break or push past a little bit just to actually get this off of the shaft itself. But we can't see that just yet until we move this forwards. So we have our messy monstrosity here. I'm going to clean this up, and then we're going to proceed with knocking it off as mentioned previously. Just going to hit this with brake clean, just so I can grab it and know that my hand isn't going to slide all that far. All right, so we have moved over to our bench vise just so you guys have kind of a better view of what we're doing. You can, of course, do this with or without the vise itself at home. Of course, it's going to be easier to do with the vise, but kind of two approaches that you can take here. So because this uses an axle bolt rather than an axle nut, you can take your old axle bolt, and then if you have a little piece of rebar or something small that you can use inside almost as a spacer, you can thread this in, start cranking it down, and it'll actually slowly push this off of the axle shaft. The alternative, which we're going to demonstrate for you here today, is if you don't have something like that, but you have a large hammer. So we're just going to kind of knock this off. Obviously, if you are reusing your outer CV, this is one that you'd probably try to avoid in case you do cause damage. Typically, though, if you were just trying to knock it off with as little damage as possible, you would aim for in the center of the joint itself, because that is free from actually moving. It just sits on the splines. So without further ado, I'm going to give this some really good hits until it eventually backs off, and then we can put on our new CV. We've removed our old CV. What I'm going to show you up close here in a second, obviously we have this off, but the force that's actually holding this on, there is not a circlip, but instead a C-clip that's right around here, just the same as on the other end where we mentioned there's that groove that's going to have a pin that's ultimately holding everything together. You have the C-clip over here, so I overcame the clamping force of that, and otherwise that's kind of all that's holding this end on. So when you really simplify the axle shaft itself, it's just a shaft with splines, and you're going to have two locking methods to hold either CV joint on. In this case, on the outer, this Volkswagen one, it's going to be the C-clip, and then on the inner, it's going to be the circlip. So to remove the circlip itself, flathead screwdriver, if you want to use a pick, whatever's going to ultimately be able to get in there and kind of pop it free. You could also use a set of pliers, that may work as well. We're ultimately just going to wiggle it off so that we can replace it with our new circlip. So we have our circlip seated, we have our spacers. Okay, so we are now nearing the point where we can put our grease back in, start putting everything back together. First things first, as always though, we want to make sure we get the clamp and the boot on first. Be a real pain if we reassemble everything and find that we forgot some of the internal pieces that are more important. We do have our circlip on here already, so that one's taken care of. I'm going to just stick that on, push down. Might need to wiggle a little bit. There we go. And I'll push it a little bit more. Boom. So that is good. Now these Volkswagens, as mentioned earlier, they do use these little spacers, so I'm going to slide that in. Alrighty, so those are good. Our next moves are going to be filling the inside of the boot with grease once again, and then also, of course, filling the joint with grease. So what we're going to do for this one, as mentioned a couple of times now, because these have an axle bolt, what I'm actually going to do is take our old axle bolt, and I'm going to cap on the inside of the CV. And what that's then going to allow me to do is actually close off this pass-through, so I can then basically just dump grease all around inside and not need to worry about it poking out the top. We want to try and avoid getting grease in these splines if we can help it. If a little gets in there, that's fine. It's just going to keep things from seizing up. But and then we're going to work everything around, put this back together, clamp the boot down, and then our circlip is actually going to lock it into place. This kit in particular from GKN actually came with 2 grease packets. We're going to put probably a whole grease packet inside of the boot itself, and then work it all around the inside with the other grease packet, and then clamp everything together. So, as mentioned, we have our old axle bolt jammed in the front of the CV. The reason that we're going to have the axle bolt threaded in here is going to be to close off the threads. Axle bolts are going to be a pretty important part of essentially the entire assembly, so we want to avoid getting grease on those because that, of course, can play with the tolerances and the torque specs when you actually lock things down. So we want to keep those threads clean, Now I'm going to take my grease, put about an entire packet of this GKN grease on the inside of the boot, and then work about a half a packet all around the inside of the CV itself. And then we'll kind of just clamp everything back together, line up the splines and knock it home, and that'll be good to go. So we have 1 packet of grease in there. I'm going to add about half of this one. Again, use the other half on our CV. Get off the excess. And then once we have this all clamped down, I'll just kind of wipe around the perimeter of the joint itself just to get any excess grease off. So I am now going to just line up the splines. Obviously, we have splines inside of the CV, inside here, and then of course on the shaft itself. So we're just going to get them lined up and then press it home. Then once you have it, we have this axle bolt in here still. You're just going to, I have a dead blow here, just gently tap it home, and you'll feel it kind of start sinking down onto the splines, and then you'll feel it slide over the circlip where it basically will lock into place. Then we'll just do our boots and we're good to go. Now that we know that it's seated, I can take an actual hammer and start giving this a little bit of force. Obviously, we want to make sure that the splines are lined up before we start smacking it with a hammer, because that's where you can actually cause some damage to the shaft itself. All right, so without further ado, I'm just going to cinch down the inner and outer boot clamps with our CTA 4210, as I did earlier with the inner, just to lock these on and lock the whole assembly together. After that, I can head back over the car. We got a brand new axle bolt to put back into the hub, and just start Loctiting everything back together and put the car together. Ultimately, these CV rebuilds are a really good way to save, honestly, hundreds of dollars. If you buy the full assembly itself, depending on the car, you're going to be paying a pretty substantial bill, whereas just buying the inner and outer resealing and replacement kits are going to save you tons of money. And as you saw here, they're really not that hard to decipher. If you just dedicate a few hours to it, you'll end up saving hundreds of dollars, and it's really not that much more effort than throwing a new replacement in anyways. So that is going to wrap up our axle rebuild video. If you have any other questions or comments, feel free to drop them below. Even let us know what you're working on, whether it's European or not. If you are working on a European vehicle yourself, feel free to hop over to our website at fcpeuro.com. We're going to have a ton of other different kits for you. And also feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, as of course we're going to have a whole bunch more videos just like this, European vehicle or not, on how to fix your car by yourself and save some money. We'll see you in the next one.